It was a few years ago, and I was in my early 20s, still in college and juggling side jobs to make ends meet. One of those jobs was pet sitting for a family who frequently went on vacations. I had already been sitting for them several times and had built a bit of a rapport. The family lived in a big old house on the outskirts of town, a place with creaky floors, high ceilings, and plenty of dark corners. It was the kind of house that had character but also gave off an unsettling vibe. The family had 4 cats, 2 of them were friendly but aloof, 1 was hyperactive, and the 4th, a small tabby named Max, was known to be a bit of a troublemaker. He wasn't dangerous, but he had a habit of getting into things he shouldn't and often hid in strange places. When the family asked me to house sit for their 2-week vacation, I agreed right away. The money was good, and I'd get a break from my hectic student life. At first, everything was fine. The house was eerily quiet, but it wasn't anything I couldn't handle. I spent most of my days attending classes, and in the evenings, would return to the house, feed the cats, and watch TV. There was something a little off about the place, though. The house had a strange energy, and I often felt like I was being watched, especially when I was in the guest bedroom. On the 4th day of house sitting, my boyfriend came over to hang out. We watched a movie in the living room and ate dinner. He knew I always felt a little uneasy in the house, so he stayed with me until late. Around midnight, he got up to leave, but before he left, he stopped and said, "You sure you're okay here tonight? The place just feels off." I assured him that I was fine. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and set the security alarm before heading to bed. I felt a bit uneasy, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. It was an old house, after all, and I had experienced strange noises before. I turned off the lights and settled in for the night, the soft hum of the air conditioning the only sound in the room. That's when it happened. The TV in the corner of the room flickered on by itself. I sat up, confused, thinking I had accidentally pressed the remote. But the remote was on the nightstand, and the TV had turned to static. I turned it off, but it came back on. This time, it wasn't just static, it was some kind of random, snowy signal. My heart raced as I tried to turn it off again. I unplugged the TV completely, trying to calm myself down. But I could still hear the faint noise of static coming from the screen. I told myself it was nothing, maybe some wiring issue from the old house. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to sleep on the couch for the rest of the night, just to be safe. The next morning, I told my boyfriend about the strange occurrence. He wasn't surprised, but he was still concerned. He said he had felt something was wrong, too, but I brushed it off. Later that night, we were having dinner together again, and that's when we heard the sound. It started faintly, what sounded like the cries of a baby. We both stopped, staring at each other, unsure if we had heard it correctly. It didn't sound like a cat, but more like a child's cry, and it seemed to be coming from the basement. We had never heard anything like that before, and I was immediately unsettled. I decided to check it out, thinking one of the cats had gotten into the basement. I went downstairs, my footsteps creaking on the stairs, and called out for Max. The crying continued, but it was so faint that it made my skin crawl. As I rounded the corner into the basement, I found Max, trapped in the spare room, meowing loudly. I let him out and went back upstairs, still shaken but trying to reassure myself. Maybe the sound wasn't as strange as I thought. But as I sat down again, trying to enjoy the movie, I heard the crying once more. This time, it was louder, and it seemed to echo through the kitchen. I glanced around and realized that none of the cats were around. They should have been there, waiting for food, but they were nowhere to be found. Feeling a rising sense of dread, I slowly got up and went into the kitchen, where the cries grew even louder. It sounded like it was coming from right under my feet. I checked under the table, then moved towards the basement door, where the sound seemed to originate. I hesitated, my hand on the handle, before finally opening it and heading down again. The crying stopped the moment I stepped foot in the basement. The silence that followed was deafening. I checked every corner, peered into every room, but Max was nowhere to be found. Panic rose in my chest. I ran up the stairs, desperate to get back to safety. When I reached the kitchen, I found my boyfriend standing there, wide-eyed. The 4 cats were all in the kitchen, gathered around him in a perfect circle. "Did you just see that?" he asked, his voice trembling. I stared at the cats. They had all appeared at once, from seemingly different parts of the house. None of them had been downstairs with me, yet there they were, watching me with unblinking eyes. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed my things, silently packing my bag. I wasn't staying there another minute. We left the house immediately, locking everything up and leaving the keys behind. I couldn't explain what had happened, and I didn't want to. The rest of the week, I went back only to feed the cats and clean their litter box, but I never stayed there again. The whole experience left me shaken, and I vowed never to return. I later found out from my sibling that they had had their own strange experiences in that house and had kept it to themselves, not wanting to worry me. After all, I was already dealing with so much, and they didn't want to scare me further. Looking back, I realize I should have left the moment I felt uncomfortable. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon when I received a call from a friend of a friend asking if I could house sit for a week. They had a cat named Felix, a quiet and somewhat aloof creature who wasn't much trouble, but the owners needed someone to watch him while they went on a week-long vacation. The pay was decent, and I didn't have anything better to do, so I agreed. The house was located in a peaceful, suburban neighborhood just on the edge of the city. It was a charming older home, with large windows and a garden in the back. The moment I walked in, Felix greeted me with his usual indifferent gaze, sniffing my shoes before heading back to his favorite spot in the sunroom. Everything seemed perfectly normal as I settled in for the evening. Felix was his usual quiet self, napping for hours on end. I spent my time reading, watching TV, and enjoying the calm atmosphere of the house. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as the days wore on, I started to feel an unsettling presence. It began on the second night. Felix started acting strangely. Normally, he would wander around the house but would stay in his designated spots. That evening, however, I noticed him pacing back and forth in front of the back door, meowing insistently, his tail flicking nervously. I went to check on him, but when I reached the door, he darted back toward the living room and crouched by the couch, staring intently at the window. I chalked it up to his usual quirks and went to bed, trying to ignore the feeling that something was off. But it didn't take long for me to realize that something was indeed wrong. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a soft scratching sound at the window. It was faint, but loud enough to wake me from my sleep. I froze, straining my ears, but the scratching stopped just as suddenly as it had started. Felix was sitting at the foot of my bed, staring out the window with wide, unblinking eyes. I tried to calm him, but he refused to look away from the window, his body tense and his ears flat against his head. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to sleep, but the scratching returned, this time louder, accompanied by the sound of faint, muffled whispers. I shot out of bed and rushed to the window, but there was no one there. The yard was empty, the night still, the only sound that of the wind rustling the trees. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just the wind or an animal, but my heart was pounding. Felix wasn't having it. He remained fixed on the window for the rest of the night, and I couldn't bring myself to sleep, pacing around the house instead, checking doors and windows. The next morning, I felt exhausted but tried to ignore the lingering fear. Felix, however, didn't act like himself. He avoided me, retreating to his favorite hiding spots, and every time I tried to approach him, he hissed and batted at me with his paws. It was when I went to feed him that I realized things were taking a much darker turn. Felix's food bowl, which I had filled the night before, was empty. I checked the kitchen and noticed the back door was slightly ajar, just enough to let a draft in. I had locked it the night before, and I couldn't understand how it had opened. My unease grew, but I dismissed it as a simple mistake. That night, the activity escalated. I was sitting in the living room, watching TV, when I felt it, a strange sensation of being watched. I turned off the TV, the room falling into an eerie silence. Felix was nowhere to be found. I searched the house, calling his name, but he didn't respond. Then, I heard it, a soft thud from upstairs. I froze. The house was quiet, too quiet. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, trying to listen, but all I could hear was the faint thumping of my own heartbeat. I slowly ascended the stairs, my steps hesitant. I reached the hallway and saw the shadow of Felix under the door of the guest bedroom. It was strange because Felix never went in there. As I opened the door, I was hit with the smell of something stale, something old. The room was dark, but I could make out Felix sitting in the corner, staring at something in the room that I couldn't see. His eyes were wide, his pupils dilated, and his body was rigid with fear. I went to pick him up, but before I could reach him, he bolted out of the room, running past me with unnatural speed. I chased after him, but by the time I got downstairs, he was gone. I searched the house for hours, but Felix was nowhere to be found. Around 3 a.m., the phone rang. It was a strange number, one I didn't recognize. Hesitant, I answered, my heart racing. The voice on the other end was distorted, almost mechanical, but the words were clear, "He's not alone." The line went dead before I could respond. My hands shook as I hung up the phone. What did it mean? What had Felix been trying to warn me about? I didn't know. But the next morning, when I went to check on the house and prepare to leave, I found something chilling. The back door was wide open. I looked out at the yard, but there was no sign of Felix. I rushed inside, calling his name, but the house was silent. I checked every room, every closet, but Felix had vanished. I never went back to that house. I left the key in its hiding spot and never looked back. The family returned to find everything in order, except for Felix, who was still missing. I don't know what happened to him, or what exactly occurred during those nights I spent alone in that house. All I know is that Felix was trying to tell me something, and whatever it was, I wasn't meant to find out. It was the summer of my sophomore year in college when I first took a job house-sitting for a family friend. They had a cat named Shadow, a sleek, black feline with green eyes that always seemed to be watching you. Shadow wasn't the most affectionate cat, but she wasn't a troublemaker either. She liked her space but would often follow me from room to room, sitting nearby as I went about my business. The family lived in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. Their house was large and old, with a lot of character. It had an eerie charm that I couldn't quite place: high ceilings, narrow hallways, and old wooden floors that creaked underfoot. The family was going on a week-long vacation, and they asked me to take care of Shadow while they were away. I agreed without hesitation. It was a perfect opportunity to earn some extra money while being away from the hustle of campus life. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time cleaning, cooking, and taking care of Shadow. She mostly kept to herself, napping in her favorite spots around the house, like the windowsill or the small couch in the living room. I was able to relax and enjoy the peace and quiet, something I hadn't had in a while with all the stress from school. But then, on the fourth night, things started to feel wrong. I had just finished dinner and was watching TV in the living room when Shadow suddenly appeared in the doorway, staring at me. She was motionless, her eyes wide, unblinking, and fixed on me. At first, I thought she just wanted attention, but there was something unsettling in her gaze. She didn't approach me as usual, but stood there, almost frozen in place. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I called her name, but she didn't respond. Instead, she started to slowly walk toward the hallway, her tail low and twitching. I followed her, curious about what she was doing. As I reached the end of the hallway, I heard a faint sound from upstairs, a soft thud, followed by what sounded like scratching at a door. I froze. The house was unusually quiet. I couldn't remember ever hearing sounds like that before. Shadow, still silent, continued to walk toward the stairs. She stopped at the bottom of the staircase and stared up at the darkened hallway above. Something about her behavior made my stomach drop. I had never seen her act like this. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly started to climb the stairs behind her. As I reached the top, I noticed that the door to the guest bedroom was slightly ajar. Shadow had been particularly drawn to that room over the past few days, even though she rarely went inside. I pushed the door open and looked inside, expecting to find nothing more than an empty room. But instead, I found the room covered in shadows. The air in the room felt cold, and there was an odd, stale smell in the air. Shadow immediately darted past me into the room, her body low to the ground, like she was hunting something. I stood frozen at the door, my pulse quickening. Then, just as I was about to call out for her, I heard a noise behind me, a soft click, like the door had just closed by itself. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I rushed into the room to find Shadow crouching under the bed, her eyes wide with fear. She was staring at something I couldn't see. My heart raced as I bent down to look under the bed, but there was nothing there. No shadows, no movement, just a pile of dust and old boxes. I called out for Shadow, but she didn't respond. She was completely focused on whatever she was seeing, her body trembling. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I checked the window, making sure it was locked, and then left the room. I closed the door behind me, but the strange sensation of being watched lingered. I went downstairs to try to calm myself, but Shadow followed me, not saying a word. She stayed by my side, her eyes still wide with fear. Later that night, I was sitting in the living room when the phone rang. I was a little startled. It was late, and I hadn't expected any calls. When I picked up the receiver, there was nothing but silence on the other end. I waited for a few seconds, but no one spoke. Then I heard the faintest sound, a soft, raspy whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. The whisper was just one word: leave. I pulled the phone away from my ear, my heart pounding. The line went dead, and I sat there in stunned silence. I hung up and tried to rationalize it. It was probably just a prank call, or maybe a glitch in the phone line. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I didn't sleep that night. Shadow stayed close to me, her usual aloofness replaced by a sense of urgency. She kept me company in the living room, refusing to leave my side. I felt as though the house was pressing in on me, suffocating me with its silence. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, seemed amplified. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare. The next morning, I woke up to find that Shadow was gone. I searched the house, calling her name, but there was no sign of her. It was like she had vanished. I checked the windows, the closets, even the basement, but Shadow was nowhere to be found. The house, which had felt so full of life just days before, now felt empty and cold. I decided to leave. I locked up the house and dropped the keys off in the designated spot, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the house in the distance, standing silent and still. I didn't return to check on Shadow. I couldn't. I felt like something had followed me, like a dark presence was lingering in the house, waiting. Weeks later, I got a message from the family saying that they had returned home and everything seemed fine. But they were puzzled when they couldn't find Shadow. They hadn't had any luck locating her, and when they asked neighbors, no one had seen her in the days leading up to their return. I never told them what happened. I never spoke of the whispers, the strange behavior, or the eerie sensation of being watched. I couldn't. Something in that house had changed, and I wasn't about to confront it again. Shadow was gone, and for some reason, I was convinced that I'd never see her again. To this day, I still wonder if I was simply imagining things, or if Shadow had been trying to warn me about something far worse than I ever expected. But one thing I know for sure, that house was not the same place it had been when I first arrived.